Tonight on Nova, the Russian right stuff. The deepest secrets of the Soviet space program can finally be told. In the early years of space exploration, while the U.S. struggled to launch its rockets, the Soviet Union scored a string of firsts that shocked the world. The Kremlin claimed it as a victory of the communist system, forcing the man who had masterminded the triumphs to remain the Invisible Spaceman.
Funding for NOVA is provided by Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. And the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the financial support of viewers like you.
In the icy wilderness of Kazakhstan, the temperature is down to minus 30 degrees. Despite the harsh conditions, in 2 days, this rocket will blast off exactly on time. This remote outpost is one part of the Soviet Union where efficiency is taken for granted. The space program remains one of the last symbols of success in a country beset by technological stagnation and economic collapse. These men will spend the next 6 months living in space. Their mission will be the latest chapter in a long tradition of space adventure. They are on their way to link up with the space station, which orbits the Earth every hour and a half. The ferrying of relief crews has become part of the routine operation of Soviet space travel. There's even an unmanned craft which delivers groceries and fuel every couple of months. Cosmonauts have logged more than 7,000 days in space. That's more than all the other nations of the world put together. It's a colossal achievement for a country that's fallen behind technologically. In the past, the Soviet space program has been used as propaganda, so the story behind its evolution has remained hidden. NOVA has followed today's cosmonauts, and through their veteran colleagues, we have attempted to unravel the truth behind the Soviet space odyssey. We begin at Star City, just outside Moscow. It's the home of the Cosmonaut Corps, where all cosmonauts prepare for their journey to space. The head of cosmonaut training is General Alexei Leonov, who is himself a pioneer cosmonaut and double hero of the Soviet Union. He likes to pull G in his Mercedes.
The people of our Star City, 3,500 people. We beginning the construction of this Star City in 1960. 30 years before, at this place was a potatoes field. Now you see building for training facilities, orbital station, and the Soyuz spacecraft. This is a cosmonaut living area. The cosmonaut study and the laboratory and the space planetarium. Water training facilities. Water training facilities. This is building for big centrifuge. I test 14G myself. I have many regimes, especially when I preparing for moon expedition.
In the Soviet Union, there is a deep-rooted passion for space exploration. But how did this vast space empire begin? What was the driving force? Leonov witnessed the origins of its spectacular success. He was the first man to walk in space. Before him was the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. The first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. The first animal to orbit the Earth, Laika. And the first satellite, Sputnik. This string of firsts shocked the world. They were portrayed as a triumph of the communist system, but they were the direct result of one man's vision. Among his secret circle, he was a legend, but officially, he did not exist. He was known only by his title, Chief Designer. The political leaders insisted that he remain anonymous. Not till after his death was his identity revealed. His name was Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. The story of Korolev's life is the story of the foundation of the Soviet space program. One of the few surviving cosmonauts who knew Sergei Korolev is Alexei Leonov. Back in 1960, when the new cosmonaut recruits began training, even they were intrigued by the mystery surrounding the chief designer. They didn't know what to expect when they met him for the first time.
I think it was in the autumn of 1960. He was the chief designer, but we simply called him SP. This stood for Sergei Pavlovich. We didn't even know his surname. We saw a government-class limousine pull up in the courtyard. A man in a dark coat with a wide-brimmed hat pulled over his eyes got out and said, "Hello, little eagles." "Hello," we all said together. He was looking at us with such intensity. It was as if he was looking through us. We understood straight away why he was the chief designer. We saw him to be a very demanding person, a demanding father figure. From the very first moment, we saw him as a father. From then on, our lives would be in his hands.
The boy who was destined to be the father of space travel was a child of the aviation age. As an adolescent, the repercussions of the revolution mattered less to him than his fascination with airplanes. His first love was flying. And in Odessa, he used to persuade the flying boat pilots to take him up for joyrides. Not content with flying planes, he wanted to design them too. He built and flew his own glider when he was 19 years old. He knew that defying Earth's gravity and flying to space was theoretically possible. But in those days, it seemed like science fiction. In 1926, Korolev went to Moscow to study aircraft design, but he dreamed of designing spacecraft which could travel at 20,000 miles per hour and go into Earth's orbit. His first step down this path came when he joined an exclusive band of young engineers driven by the idea of building rockets. They knew that rocket engines were capable of operating in the vacuum of space. The group called itself GERD. They fired their first rockets 20 miles from Moscow, in the heart of what is now the Nakabino military base. For James Oberg, this is a pilgrimage to a sacred place. Oberg is a NASA mission controller from Houston. He has spent the last 20 years investigating the history of the Soviet space program. He was one of the first in the West to publish episodes of Korolev's life that were missing from the official Soviet histories.
Korolev, Sander, Tikhorovov.
This is the place where Korolev and the GERD group lit the fuses of their first liquid-fueled rockets. Here, the seeds of today's space program were sown.
Well, the men and women who built these rockets were a group of real fanatics and dedicated to it, and they had to be because there was not a lot of official support for it. They received no salaries, and getting materials to build the rocket and the control system was a big challenge to them. They would melt down family jewelry, for example, to get some silver. So they would do all these things. They made a joke about it. The initials GEARD stand for, formally, the group of engineers developing on rocket propulsion. But they said it meant the group of engineers working for free because they did that. They were dedicated. And for some of them, like Korolev, his entire life was spent from here on building these kind of rockets, and everything else was sacrificed. Korolev clearly was the star, and he became the chief engineer. He knew how to solve the problems, but it's a very special kind of skill as an engineer to look at a challenging problem and say, well, what pieces do we solve first, and where do you put the resources? Korolev here cut his teeth on this kind of techniques that he later used to open the space frontier.
Their first rockets barely escaped the treetops. They were a long way from attaining high enough speeds to reach space. But they had learned how to control the potentially explosive fuel mixture. And by 1933, under Korolev's leadership, their rockets could fly at 2,000 miles per hour. The success of the GERD group started to interest the Red Army. With military backing, they were transformed into a well-funded rocket research institute for producing weapons. So any idea of space travel took a backward step. And for Korolev, who had been given a military rank, the Army would turn out to be a dangerous friend. Marshal Tukhachevsky, the commander-in-chief of the Red Army, had personally backed Korolev's rocket group. In a fit of paranoia, Stalin decided that Tukhachevsky and his officers were plotting to overthrow the state. Tukhachevsky was shot. Many innocent officers faced show trials. Half the entire officer corps was executed. Korolev and his family would become a target.
There were mass arrests in the rocket section of the institute where he worked. Frankly, everybody was expecting that they would be next. It was the 27th of June, 1938. I was coming home from work.
The Korolevs lived in a small Moscow apartment. For Mrs. Korolev, who was a young doctor at the time, returning there evokes painful memories of a terrible night.
As I got near home, I saw that there were two people waiting. Those two people were responsible for all our misfortune. I immediately understood why they had come. It was our turn, the turn of Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. At around midnight, there was a knock on the door. They told Sergei Pavlovich to get dressed. He put on the leather coat he usually wore. I naively gave him 2 changes of underwear for the journey. We said goodbye and kissed each other. But when I wanted to go downstairs to see him off in the car, they prevented me quite roughly. I remained alone in the flat. I had golden hair, and it went completely gray overnight.
Yaroslav Golovanov, Korolyov's biographer, is only now able to talk openly about this disastrous chapter of Korolyov's life. Until recently, his epic biography could not leave his study. The truth of how Soviet rocketry was set back years was too painful for the censors to contemplate. All official accounts skipped the next decade of Korolyov's life.
Unfortunately, his attitude towards his arrest was the same as everyone else at that time. He thought that it would be all sorted out, that it was a mistake, and when he was sentenced to 10 years in a camp a month later, he was totally broken and in a terrible state. He suffered greatly. He was accused of having done everything in his power, on the orders of the Trotskyites, to undermine the defense capabilities of the Red Army. There were 18 criminal charges, of which not one word, not one was true. He was even accused of having burned his rocket-powered plane. But at the time, it was actually in the courtyard of the institute, and anyone could have seen it there.
Denounced as an enemy of the state, Korolyov was sent to the infamous Kolyma gold mines on the far eastern coast in 1938. Few survived the hardships of the 10-month winters. Then, with the world on the verge of war, Stalin's defense advisors scoured their labor camps for their rocket engineers and plane designers who were suddenly needed by the motherland. Korolyov was ordered back to Moscow, where he was put to work on the war effort. He remained under house arrest.
They didn't feel bitter or resentful, but worked as hard as they could, not out of fear, but because they felt it was right that they should. I think that this is a special quality of our people, our Soviet people.
Korolyov was sidetracked into designing rocket planes. While rocket research had stagnated in the Soviet Union, in Germany, Werner von Braun was developing a weapon which nearly changed the outcome of the war. The V-2 rocket, which was used to bomb London, was almost powerful enough to reach space. After the Allied invasion, enough spare parts to make 100 rockets were shipped to the United States, along with the most important designers. Von Braun, the man with his arm in a cast, was the prime catch. He would eventually become Korolyov's rival at NASA. They always wanted to meet, but never did. Before leaving, the Americans destroyed the remnants of the rocket factories. By the time the Soviet Army arrived, all that was left was a few rocket parts, some technicians, and a rocket guidance expert. With this inauspicious start, Korolyov was dispatched to Berlin to salvage the pieces. Without the benefit of the German engineers, he had to build a copy of von Braun's rocket.
Well, I met him for the first time in Berlin, and he made a great impression on me. This was the first time I'd met a person who understood all the subtleties of rocket construction. But at the same time, he was sort of tough and distrustful. Maybe life had made him like this. But he wouldn't tolerate lies. It was very difficult to win his confidence and very easy to lose it.
After 10 years in the wilderness, the Soviet Union was finally ready to fire a rocket again. In 1947, at a new test site by the River Volga, Korolev's copy of von Braun's rocket was prepared for launch. Korolev was now responsible for all rocket development. His R-1 rocket could travel at 3,500 miles an hour. It had just enough thrust to reach the edge of space. The rocket went into military service as the Red Army missile. But Korolev had his own plans. The spark of his early ambitions to reach space still dominated his life. He worked day and night at the test range. He was seeing less and less of his wife. And one day, a young translator walked into his life.
He said, "Would you object to us spending some time together?" I said, "What do you have in mind?" "Well, we could go to a restaurant." I said that I wasn't used to going to restaurants. "What's the problem? Your clothes?" "You know my clothes have never bothered me." "Well, if they don't bother you, let's go." I lived with my mother on the first floor. It turned out that he lived in the same building, but on the second floor. He invited me into his flat. I went in and stayed there for good. All his dreams were taking shape. He wanted to do non-military research, to explore space, to plan flights to some of the closer planets, and maybe to more distant ones as well, if the will was there, and they had the knowledge to do so. He thought about space all the time. It was his life.
Korolev wanted to conduct experiments to explore the upper atmosphere and space. By replacing the warhead, the missile could be turned into a space probe. But to enter orbit would require a much larger multi-stage rocket. The Cold War would provide the political pressure to design such a rocket.
Well, my views on this are well known. Our country was encircled by military and naval bases scattered all around the borders, from which the Americans, with their monopoly on the atomic bomb, could reach any of our major cities. But we couldn't reach America. So, despite the pitiful state our country was in after the war, there's no way of getting away from this. We needed to design and to build a delivery system capable of carrying our nuclear warheads all the way to America. And we beat them.
They would need a larger rocket because the Soviet bomb was twice the weight of the American bomb. Ironically, the Soviet failure to make their bombs smaller would ultimately give them the lead in the space race. To accommodate the bigger rockets, a new launch site was constructed at a secret location in a remote region of Kazakhstan. It was well out of range of American radar and far enough away from any populated area in the event of accidents. The multi-stage rocket was called R-7. It took several days to prepare for launch, so it was a very inefficient military missile. But it was an excellent space rocket, as the world would soon discover. Korolev had used military funding to create the world's most ambitious space program. The Baikonur Cosmodrome was becoming the heart of an empire with space research as the goal. One of his young designers was Konstantin Feoktistov.
He created his own feudalist state. Of course, he didn't do this on his own. The upper echelons of the administration were also involved, but he gradually became the head of this empire. He was a very ambitious person. Maybe this ambition was the main driving force in his life. But his ambition was not to move up the ladder or to win medals. Not that he would turn his back on either, but the most important thing for him was to do something big with his life.
After the first successful flight of R-7 on August 3, 1957, the stage was set for the launch of the world's first satellite. The Soviet Academy of Sciences had to give permission for the launch. Many members thought Sputnik was pure fantasy, believing such a feat would not be possible till the next century. But Korolev, with some extra pressure from Khrushchev, persuaded them that the time was right. The first Sputnik contained a simple radio transmitter. It was called PS, for primary satellite, although the workers christened it SP, for Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. Sputnik circled the Earth 16 times a day for 90 days before it finally burned up.
Well, it was a spectacular accomplishment because it was a real breakthrough into space, and people quickly recognized that it was something new and something very special. Here in Red Square and elsewhere in Russia, they could look up in the sky and actually see the star going across the sky that their scientists had put up into space. It was visible, not just over here, but all around the world. The Soviets published schedules of when Sputnik was passing over New York, Amsterdam, London, Peking, and Little Rock. The broader political impact seemed to have been a greatly enhanced appreciation of Soviet technical skills. In fact, an over-appreciation, an exaggeration in many ways. But the impact was that, long thought of as a backward nation, Russia had, by this single step, established itself as a world-class power in at least one area of high technology.
You know, people underestimated the impact the launch of the first Sputnik would have. Maybe the only person who really anticipated this was Korolev. We were thought to be crazy. It was as if we were launching a baby's rattle. It was only after the launch of the first Sputnik, when the politicians saw what an impression it made on the world, that they realized they couldn't possibly allow anyone else to know how they had done it.
Sometime later, our country was approached by the Nobel Prize Committee. They wanted to know who we would like to see win the Nobel Prize for this work. And Sergei Pavlovich told me about this. What do you think our government answered?
Who in particular?
Khrushchev, Nikita Sergeyevich. He said, all the Soviet people.
Всем советским людям особенно приятно, что коллективы научно-исследовательских институтов, конструкторских бюро, заводов и исполнительных организаций, создавшие новую ракету, посвящает этот пуск 21-му съезду Коммунистической партии Советского Союза.
Khrushchev's decision to hide Korolev's identity meant there was no Nobel Prize for Sputnik.
After the launch of the first Sputnik, Korolev sent us away for a rest. We hadn't had a holiday for 8 to 10 years. After only a week, a telegram arrived from Korolev telling us to come back at once. Khrushchev had given the go-ahead for the launch of a second Sputnik.
He was asked by Khrushchev, can you do something else by next month for the Revolution Day parade? And you'll have the entire resources of the country at your disposal for it. Well, Korolev naturally said, of course he could. He could do a bigger satellite, and he suggested we could put a dog in it. We can put a living thing in it. Well, this, of course, Khrushchev loved the idea. So they went ahead and they built this. They took the basic Sputnik electronics and here in a backup system, additional controls here, and hooked down to it a canister down here. And in this canister, they put the dog, Laika.
Laika's fate would be to orbit the Earth for 6 days. After that, her oxygen would run out. Korolev wanted to test the effect of weightlessness and radiation on a living creature. Laika was chosen for her good temper. She was launched in Sputnik 2 on 3rd November 1957. The American rocket tests were not doing so well. They kept blowing up. And unlike the Soviet Union, the failures were always publicized in humiliating detail.
7, 6, 5. The United States is ready to try and place its first Earth satellite into orbit. And there is a sudden tremendous burst of flame. We can see the Jupiter...
Khrushchev had already ridiculed the first American satellite, describing it as a mere grapefruit. NASA's rocket chief, von Braun, had some catching up to do.
Let's not forget that our payload is only a fraction of what Sputnik 1 was, and a small fraction of Sputnik 2's 1,100 pounds payload weight in orbit. So, again, I can only repeat what I said before. We are competing only in spirit with Sputnik 2 so far, not in hardware yet.
Sputnik 3 was an even greater shock to NASA. It weighed in at 1.5 tons. But Korolev's next challenge to the West was his masterpiece. He called it Vostok, which means the East.
Work on the Vostok began in 1958. This here is a very interesting book. It is the original design specification showing how we tackled the problems of sending the first person into space. The task before us was to build a spaceship which would enable a person, this is the Earth, which would launch a person to go into orbit and travel in space for 10 days before landing back on Earth. The landing was to be by parachute. The cosmonaut would be ejected at a height of 7 kilometers. The capsule would land independently by parachute. We did these drawings to show that there would be space to get out of the seat and move about, so that the cosmonaut would feel free in the weightless conditions.
Korolev had always fantasized about flying to space himself, but he knew this was one dream that could never come true. A selection group was set up to find suitable volunteers. The lucky recruits would be codenamed Little Eagles.
He used to say to Karpov, who was in charge of cosmonaut selection, "Find me a guy with guts, who won't chicken out." I don't really believe that Korolev thought about the sort of qualities a person should have. His only requirements were that the person should be small enough to fit in the spaceship and be relatively light, not more than 75 kilograms. But these were purely technical requirements. I don't think that he considered character.
No one knew what special qualities would be needed in space. But the Soviet Air Force, like their American counterparts, thought their fighter pilots had the right stuff.
On long-distance flights, a fighter pilot maintains radio contact and looks after his own navigation. He will experience severe pressure, vibrations, weightlessness, noise, and he is prepared to act in any situation in response to the slightest change in conditions. All this is even more true of space flights.
We didn't know that we were to become cosmonauts. We went there as prospective test pilots. I walked into one of the hospital wards. I saw a young man of my age sitting on a bed. He was only wearing pyjama bottoms. It was hot in the ward. He was reading. When he closed the book, I saw that it was by Ernest Hemingway. I was amazed. He wasn't a well-known writer, and in this room I suddenly met a man reading Hemingway. Then the man got up and said, "Yuri Gagarin."
Gagarin and Leonov were among hundreds of pilots going through cosmonaut selection in 1959. They were put through the worst imaginable excesses of space travel. Many were injured. Some died. Of the 20 selected, 12 would make it into space. Alexei Leonov was one of them.
The first thing we had to do was parachute training. We had to learn to control the parachute after ejection from the ship. We were ejected from the Vostok at the height of 4,000 meters. Pilots don't like it, and they don't do it willingly. But in 1 month, we had to do 40 parachute jumps, which is a lot for any pilot, especially fighter pilots.
It was not until after a year of training that the future cosmonauts were allowed to meet the elusive chief designer. Each was eager to catch his eye.
"Hello, little eagles," said Korolev. Then he unfolded a big sheet of paper and started going through the names in alphabetic order.
A. Аникеев, Б. Быковский, В. Волынов, Г. Гагарин. Он на него посмотрел.
He looked at him, and his eyes exuded kindness. He started asking Yuri Gagarin about his parents, where he was from, everything. It was clear that Sergei Pavlovich Korolev liked Gagarin.
Eventually, the cosmonauts were taken to see the Vostok spaceship.
We first saw the Vostok spaceship when we visited the factory floor at the invitation of Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. We saw a whole row of little balls in a giant factory. It was amazing. It wasn't the ship itself that impressed me, but its appearance, which was unusually silvery. It was the most silvery spaceship of all the spaceships that we ever produced and launched into space.
The capsule sat on top of a service module. The little round tanks contained oxygen for the mission. It was attached by a kind of luggage strap, which released when the silver ball was ready to return to Earth. Vostok was a fully automatic spaceship. The pilots would have little to do. The first orbital flight was successfully completed by Belka and Strelka, another canine first. Unlike Laika, they were parachuted safely back to Earth. Before a man with guts was allowed inside Vostok, another flight was successfully completed by a mannequin. These unmanned test flights highlighted the growing unease among the ex-fighter jocks, who did not like the idea of being spam in a can.
In the beginning of both the American and the Soviet program, this issue of, is the person an experimental specimen or is he part of flying the ship? That was a major issue. What concerned the doctors very much was that the human beings in here, unlike the animals that could make the flight and come back, a person could think about where they were. They could realize they were in space at 5 miles a second, above the atmosphere, facing fiery re-entry, and isolated. These kinds of thoughts could drive even the sanest person to mindless terror. You can imagine a person in here panicking and just thrashing around, hitting the controls and totally ruining the flight and not coming back at all. There was this massive debate how much control they should be allowed. At first, they said, well, we'll put a lock on the control system, and we'll put a combination on it, and we'll radio you the combination if you need it. Well, Korolev realized right away the radio would be the first thing to break, and they're out of touch for hours on end, so they did away with that. The cosmonauts wanted to be given the combination, maybe write it down on their hand or something, before the flight. Doctors didn't want to do that because that was too obvious. So they came to a compromise. They said, well, write the combination down on a piece of paper. You can put it in your flight suit or tape it to the wall. And only if you need it, then you can open the combination, look at it, punch in right here, like 145 for Gagarin, but activate the manual system to override the automatic system, allow him to use the hand controllers over there, and even fire the braking rocket manually.
In March 1961, the cosmonauts were taken down to Baikonur to see the rocket, just 3 weeks before one of them would be launched into space.
Our leaders were terrified that a launch might end in disaster. An unsuccessful launch of a human being into space couldn't be hidden from the general public. And a calamity would reflect badly on the politicians. So they demanded certain guarantees. In the end, Korolev gave them these guarantees. He had to do this, although he knew perfectly well that there was a high degree of risk involved in this project. The only person who dared to authorize sending a human being into space was Korolev.
A few days before the launch, Korolev joined the cosmonauts for some rest and relaxation at a Black Sea resort. Gagarin, who had long been the favorite, was confirmed as the first man to be launched. anonymous chief designer was about to strike again, 10 months before the Americans were ready to launch their first man into orbit.
Зажигание.
Понял, отдается зажигание.
The flight was fully automatic, as planned. Gagarin never needed to touch the controls. He skimmed over the Pacific Ocean in 20 minutes. Once again, Korolev had made history. But while the chief designer remained unknown, Gagarin had become the most famous person in the world. He had landed safely a few miles away after ejecting from his capsule with his own parachute.
Well, a few days after the flight, someone realized that to file for an international flight record one requirement was the pilot had to actually take off and land in a ship. And Gagarin obviously had not. And because that was a technicality that might interfere with the world record, they decided the easy way out was just to lie about it. At the press conference, Gagarin was sitting at the table. He was instructed by his handler to say that if he was asked about landing, he landed in his ship. That was the official line, and it stayed that way for about a quarter of a century, until just recently.
Знаете, каким он парнем был, как поля родные он любил. В той степной дали первый старт земли был признанием ей в любви. Он сказал, поехали, он взмахнул рукой, словно вдаль по Питерской пронесся над землей.
Only in the grounds of his own design bureau could Korolev at last share the stage with Gagarin.
Принести глубокую благодарность вам за ваш замечательный труд. Я думаю, что еще не одна космическая дорожка начнется, заложенная вашим разумом и вашими золотыми руками.
He would come to work in the morning, and the mornings would routinely begin with bad news. He would be told that an engine had burned out, or a tank had exploded during testing, or something had fallen to pieces. He understood that this was the lot of the chief designer. He would call together all the people responsible, engineers, designers, and test controllers. Then he would begin to sort it all out. He would bawl people out. And then, at the end of the meeting, he would take a decision. He would never simply impose a decision, but would let others have their say. This went on from early morning till late into the night.
By the summer of '63, Korolev's cosmonauts had flown 4 times. Khrushchev was pressing for another space first. Korolev came up with an idea which would shock the cosmonaut corps and satisfy Khrushchev's thirst for publicity.
I know for certain that it was Korolev's idea to send the first woman into space. He wanted to prove that anyone, a man or a woman who was physically strong and healthy, with a normal sense of balance, could do it, if they had the courage. But of course, not everyone could do it.
4 women were selected for training. The final choice was between 2 candidates.
In the end, the argument was settled by Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. He studied the girls' backgrounds and photographs. The thing that he liked about Tereshkova was that she was from a humble family. Her father had been killed in the war, and she worked in a textile factory. For Khrushchev, these biographical details ensured that the first woman in space would be working class. And this was how Tereshkova came to be chosen.
The other contender was airbrushed out of the official history. During the training period, Tereshkova had to invent a cover story. Even her mother was not allowed to know where she was or what she was doing. The plan was to rendezvous with cosmonaut Bukovsky in another Vostok craft. They flew around the Earth only a few miles apart. By the time her mission was over, she had logged more hours of spaceflight than all the American astronauts put together.
Я вас очень хорошо слышал. Со мной рядом находится товарищ Брежнев.
Although Tereshkova's mission was a great political triumph, privately, Korolev was not pleased with her performance in flight. She did not complete all her experiments. Apparently, she had fallen asleep so deeply, the doctors feared she had become unconscious.
I can tell you what he said. Remember, little one, as he used to call me, space is no place for broads. He should have said women. But this is how he said it to me.
Glory to our seagull, Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in the world to go out into space. Long live the Soviet Communist Party, the great organizer of our victories.
Korolev always looked after his cosmonauts and was happy to promote their achievements. While they were rewarded with fame, he remained the chief designer, a faceless father.
I think that he was depressed by his anonymity. After the first space flights turned the cosmonauts into world heroes, he felt that it was unfair that he should stay in the shadows. It's true, he used to say to friends that perhaps it was better that way, that he was saved from the bureaucrats and interviews with journalists. But I don't really believe that, because he was an ambitious man, and he wanted his share of the glory, glory that he well deserved.
Korolev had laid the foundations and become the emperor of space travel. The growth of his empire had enabled the Soviet Union to take the lead in the space race. But a new race was about to begin, the race to the moon, which would make the empire tremble. While Korolev and his designers plotted the next move, the new heroes of the cosmos toured the world.
Знаете, каким он парнем был, на руках весь мир его носил. Сын земли и звезд не был и прост, людям свет как дан понес. Он сказал, поехали, он взмахнул рукой, словно вдаль по питерской пронесся над землей. Словно вдаль по питерской пронесся над землей. Знаете, каким он парнем был, как на лед он с клюшкой выходил, как он песни пел весел, был и смел, как азартно жить хотел. Он сказал, поехали, он взмахнул рукой, словно вдаль по питерской несется над землей.
Funding for NOVA is provided by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. And Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the financial support of viewers like you. For a transcript of this program, send $5 to this address or call 212-227-READ.
This is PBS. Most NOVA programs are available on videocassette. Schools, businesses, and organizations interested in purchasing videocassettes should call 1-800-441-NOVA.